And the final thing I want to say before I introduce Tim is that I want to acknowledge that the land we are on is the ancestral land of the Ohlone tribe. Today, we acknowledge the impact colonization had on the Ohlone and recognize our responsibility to help them heal from this history and secure a sustainable future. And now we're going to hear from our speakers. Tim Redmond is, for my money, absolutely the most astute observer of San Francisco's political landscape that there is. Tim has been a political and investigative reporter for San Francisco for more than 30 years, most of the time as executive editor of the Bay Guardian. He is the founder of community-supported 48 Hills, and San Francisco's largest daily independent community news and culture site with 35,000 readers a week. Tim's going to give us a rundown of the significant SF and state November election ballot measures and races. Tim Redmond.
Thank you, Art.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm always happy to speak to this group, and I've got about 15 minutes, right?
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to move quickly because there's the first thing to understand is there's a lot on the ballot. There's a lot on the local ballot that we should care about. And there's some stuff on the state ballot that we should definitely care about that's not getting a whole lot of attention. So let me start with the local ballot. Okay.
Do that later.
Whoever's speaking, please mute yourself. Go ahead, Tim.
Okay. I thought that was a question before I even got started. Okay, so there are 4 local candidate races that are significant on the San Francisco ballot. And one of them is, of course, the race for district attorney. And this is really important because the current district attorney, Brooke Jenkins, was appointed by Mayor London Breed after the recall of Chesapeake. Right now, whatever your position is on the recall, set that aside for a moment. I know that's hard to do, but set that aside for a moment. After Chesapeake was recalled, London Breed had the opportunity to find a widely respected, non-political prosecutor with a lot of experience running an office, who could be respected by the moderates and the progressives could accept, and who was basically just an honest prosecutor whose political positions may have differed a bit from Chesapeake. She didn't do that. She picked a very inexperienced person, Brooke Jenkins, who has been a prosecutor but has never managed anything, much less an office with 300 employees. She's never managed anything. The day she walked in and met her staff, a mayoral aide was at her side, and it's become very clear that her policies are simply politically designed to support the mayor's priorities. Right? This is all the talk about cracking down on open-air drug sales in the Tenderloin, which, again, whatever you think about drug sales in the Tenderloin, this is not something that can be, her position cannot be defended by any type of social justice or criminological thing. Busting small-time dealers never works. The war on drugs was a failure, all right? And besides, even if the police arrested every small-time drug dealer in the Tenderloin, there would be no place to put them because the jails are already overcrowded given COVID, and the sheriff's office is understaffed and can't take any more prisoners, right? So they're going to be released anyway. Everyone that they arrest, the judges are going to release anyway because there's no place to put them, and then they'll be back on the streets, right? But this is a political position that the mayor has taken that has gone into the DA's office. Now, there are 2 major candidates, more or less, running against Brooke Jenkins, and one of them is John Hamasaki. John got into the race basically on the last day. And what he told me was basically what I've told you when I talked to him about it. He said, look, a lot of us were willing to wait on the sidelines. This is a 1-year position. She has to face the voters because she was just appointed, but the term actually ends next year anyway. So she will have, if she survives this fall, she will have to run for a 4-year term in a year anyway. There's plenty of time to build a campaign. Maybe Chesa runs again, maybe someone else runs. We were all willing to set aside. And then we saw what happened, which is basically a train wreck. All right. Already, Brooke Jenkins gave misleading and inaccurate information about her role in the campaign and the $150,000 she was paid by essentially the same organization that was working to recall Chesapeake. She has fired a lot of veteran prosecutors. What I'm hearing from her office is people are walking around saying there's no one in charge. So Hamasaki said, someone's got to do this. And he got into the race. He is a former police commissioner. He's already got widespread support from progressives. The other candidate is Joe Eliotto Veronese, who, if anything, is running to the right of Brooke Jenkins. He's trying to portray himself as an old-fashioned law and order person. He will get some votes because the name Alioto still matters in some parts of the city, and a conservative Alioto will get some votes. So the interesting question is, does he siphon off some of the conservative votes from her, leaving Hamasaki with an opening to run as a progressive prosecutor? It's going to be a sprint. There's only a couple of months here before the ballots drop, right? Okay, moving on. There are two highly contested races for the Board of Supervisors that could determine the makeup of control on the board. Right now, the progressives have a clear 7-vote, sometimes 8-vote majority on the Board of Supervisors, the ability to decide who's the president of the board, and in some cases, override mayoral vetoes. Okay. District 4, longtime progressive stalwart Gordon Marr, is being challenged by two candidates, Leanna Louie and Joe Longardio, both running much more conservative campaigns, both of them supporters of the DA recall and the school board recall. There's already questions about both of them. Leanna Louie only moved into the district 27 days before the filing deadline, which by some accounts does not make her a legal candidate because you're supposed to be there for 30 days. Joe Longardio didn't live in the district until they changed the district lines. Not his fault. He didn't move into the district moved into him. But District 4 is more conservative than it was. That's the problem with the redistricting, is they made a more conservative district. Gordon's going to have a challenge. That is not a slam dunk. That is not an easy race, right? Either one of the challengers to Gordon would shift the Board of Supervisors significantly to the center right. Okay, now we've got D6. Matt Haney decided in his own wisdom and ambition to give up his D6 seat to run for the state assembly. And he won. He was elected to the state assembly, therefore giving up D6 to the mayor's office for an appointment. D6 has always been a very, very progressive district. From the days of Chris Daly through Jane Kim, Matt Haney was always one of the progressives until he decided to run for state assembly and he started changing his positions. We'll talk more about that later. But now the mayor appointed Matt Dorsey. Matt Dorsey was the director of communications for the San Francisco Police Department for a couple of years after being the city attorney's press officer. He was in charge of a $1.6 million operation that has been derided as propaganda, as putting out the best possible spin on a police department that is badly lacking in reform. Matt is a very smart guy politically. And his main challenger is Honey Mahogany. And Honey was Matt Haney's chief of staff. So they both have kind of a challenge here, all right? No one thinks that D6 is doing great right now. No one thinks everything is fine in D6. Right? Both candidates bear some responsibility. Right? Dorsey because he's the incumbent, and Mahogany because she was chief of staff to the previous incumbent. Plus, again, thank you redistricting commission controlled by Mayor Breed. District 6 is now a more conservative district. Right? Partially, a lot more wealthy condo owners have moved in, but the district has moved. The Tenderloin is no longer part of D6. Right? So it is a more conservative district. Thus far, what I have seen in my following this district race is that neither Honey Mahogany nor Matt Dorsey has taken any profound positions that separate them from the other. They're both kind of saying we're all in favor of building more housing. We need more market rate housing as well as affordable housing. Public safety is the #1 issue in the district. We have to make sure that the police department is supported. They're not really, neither one of them. Honey Mahogany is not running the kind of left progressive agenda that we have seen from previous supervisors from that district, in part because I think the district has changed. Right? But again, if Matt Dorsey wins a full term in November, he will move the board again significantly to the center right. Okay, the last interesting race is for public defender. Now, we haven't had a race for public defender in a long, long time, 20 years or something. The incumbent public defender, Mano Raju, has by most accounts done a very good job. Rebecca Young, who used to work in the public defender's office and did mostly juvenile stuff and did a great job. I worked with her in a bunch of cases, as a journalist. She has decided, after leaving to work in the DA's office, and then of course being part of the people who were fired from the DA's office under the new DA, she's running against him. And the argument seems to be, as best as I can tell, she is making the argument that the current public defender spends a fair amount of money, which is true, on policy work and on crime prevention programs and on violence prevention programs that aren't directly related to defending people in the courtroom. He's turned the public defender's office into not only a premier defender's office trying to defend people accused of crimes in the courtroom, but also taking on policy issues. She is arguing that all that money should go directly into lawyers and defending people in the courtroom. Right? Interesting discussion. I have not seen her get a lot of traction yet. It looks like most of the traction is with the incumbent. Okay, let me talk a little bit about some of the key things that are on the local ballot, right? And there's a couple. And one is affordable housing. There are two competing affordable housing measures on the ballot. One of them is the affordable housing measure put on the ballot by the YIMBYs. And we don't have ballot designations, I don't think yet. I'm going to check right now. I was going to do this in advance. Oh, we do. We do now have ballot designations. Okay, so there's Prop C and Prop D. Excuse me, Prop D and Prop E. All right, Prop D was put on the ballot by the YIMBYs. Right, and both measures do something everyone thinks is a good idea, which is streamline affordable housing production. Basically, make it easier for 100% affordable housing projects that are not 100% affordable housing, but have more than the required amount of affordable housing, and projects that are designed at least in part for public school teachers can move through the process more quickly. So there are not the types of delays that we sometimes see in these projects. Everyone thinks that's a good idea, right? The big difference is the YIMBYs measure is more sweeping, defines affordable housing more broadly to include up to 120% of median, right? Which means housing for people whose income, who are making 100 and something $1,000 a year, right? That's closer to what market rate housing currently is, but that would get approved as affordable housing. Right? And the supervisor's measure, the competing supervisor's measure, also streamlines things for affordable housing, but defines affordable housing slightly lower, which the developers don't like, of course, because the developers would rather subsidize a more expensive apartment than subsidize a cheaper apartment. The other thing that the supervisor's measure does is it requires project labor agreements. It requires union labor, and it requires that on most projects, the labor comes from skilled apprentices in the union field. Right? The YIMBY measure has no labor provisions whatsoever. Again, the developers like the YIMBY provision because they can build cheaper. They don't have to pay union scale. Right? And the subsidies aren't as deep. Right? So those are competing measures, and we're going to see a lot of talk about both of them. All right. There's also two competing measures, and I'm going to give you the ballot designations right now. Hold on. There's two competing measures on the Great Highway, right? One, which is Prop I. Prop I was put on the ballot by people who live in the outer Sunset and outer Richmond, who hate the idea of the Great Highway being closed to cars. And these folks will tell you that they are not against bicycles, but that when the Great Highway is closed to cars, those cars then move into the neighborhood. And they have turned 48th and 47th Street into much more congested areas, right? At the same time, they're going after Golden Gate Park, and they're going after the idea of closing Golden Gate Park to cars. This is supported by the institutions in Golden Gate Park, the Academy of Sciences and the de Young Museum, which like the idea of people being able to drive through the park to park and go to their institutions, right? It's also supported by some folks who say that when you stop parking in Golden Gate Park, particularly on the weekends, it's harder for people who are mobility challenged to get to the park and the institutions. Supervisor Shaman Walton says that his constituents out in Bayview can't get to the park on weekends because it's too far to take the buses. You can't get to Golden Gate Park from Bayview on the bus, and if they're going to go have a picnic, they need to drive. So he's also kind of in the leave Golden Gate Park open to cars. Right? Most of the rest of the Board of Supervisors and most of the bicycle advocates in the city are with the other proposition that would essentially put in place the current procedures. Right? By law, would put in place the current procedures, which is that the Great Highway would be closed on weekends and JFK Drive would be closed most of the time to cars. right? So those are going to be battles that are going to be fought out over competing ballot measures. I'm almost out of time, but there's a couple things I want to also mention. All right, there is a measure on the ballot, and I'm pulling up the. There are two other things that I want to talk about, and one of them, hold on, is Proposition M, and Prop M is a tax on vacant residential units. All right, this is really important because there are, by most estimates, about 40,000 residential units that are vacant in San Francisco right now. And this would encourage landlords who have vacant units to put them on the market. And if they don't, this would provide income for affordable housing. All right, so that's also a very significant thing that's on the ballot, as is, hold on, I'm pull up the ballot measure here, as is Proposition H. Proposition H, you haven't heard a lot about, but Prop H would change city elections for top offices like the mayor and the district attorney and the city attorney to even numbered years. This has potentially profound consequences. Right? If we elected the mayor in the same year that we elected the governor and the president, or in this case, it would be the president, turnout is way, way higher, right? If we elect the mayor in a year when turnout is much higher, right, you're going to get a more representative vote for mayor of San Francisco. Now, the argument against it is that the mayor's race could get lost in a presidential campaign. Everyone's thinking about the president, they're not thinking about local issues. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think actually what we're going to see is much higher turnout and therefore a more democratic selection of who is in the mayor. Now I'm really, really out of time. The two measures that you're going to hear a lot about, you're already hearing a lot about on the state ballot, are 26 and 27. That is all about sports wagering. Right? You have already seen these ads if you watch TV at all. I watch the Giants game on TV, and every time I turn on the Giants game, there's many, many ads for 26 and 27. Both of these measures would in one way or another legalize sports gambling. The argument for that, of course, is it's already happening. People in San Francisco, I don't, but lots of people I know bet on sporting events. And they bet illegally on sporting events, sometimes through apps that they can use with out of state and out of country and whatever. Right? It's happening anyway. We might as well legalize it and tax it, is the argument. And I generally am all in favor of that. The issue here is that Prop 26 is put on the ballot by the bigger Native American tribes that already have casinos. And that would allow sports gambling in casinos. You can go and bet on the Giants game, but you got to go to a Native American casino to do it. All right. Prop 27 was basically put on the ballot and is being funded by the companies that do sports gambling, like DraftKings, and these companies that do online sports gambling. They want me to be able to go on my phone and bet on the Giants game on the phone legally through them. Right. These are big Vegas operators. Right. They have teamed up with the smaller tribes who don't get revenue from the gambling operations on tribal casinos. And I've got 1 minute left to speak, and I'm going to just about stop here. But that's what's going on with these. Each side is going to put up at least $50 million because there's a huge, huge amount of money to be made in this. And unfortunately, it's split the tribes. Now, Prop 27 also talks about funding for homelessness. The reality is, yeah, the lottery was supposed to help the public schools too. There's not a lot of funding for homelessness in Prop 27. Prop 27 is big Vegas operators who want to make money on online sports gambling. All right, I'll stop now and take questions. I hope that's a good, brief, very brief overview of some of the highlights of the fall ballot.
Thanks so much for that sprint through the ballot in San Francisco, Tim. It's kind of, I apologize for not giving you more time than that.
No, I understand.
And we're going to take questions now until 1:40. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand using the reactions button, or simply raise your hand like this so you can be seen. And Matthew Holtz will help me call on people. And if you prefer, you can also put a question in the chat, but your chances are better of getting it answered if you raise your hand. So we'll do this until for the next 15 minutes, and then I hope I can make a deal with Tim that he makes himself available some other time for another Q&A session.
I am always available to speak to the Great Panthers anytime you want.
Okay, so we'll have a special time with Tim Redmond, schedule that after this is over, so don't panic. Okay, Cynthia, Joe, can you make your comment or question in 30 seconds to make sure other people have a chance to ask?
Well, after hearing Tim, I think we should vote no on 26 and 27.
You are, let me just say, you are not the only one who feels that way. You're not the only one who feels like the determination of whether we do online sports gambling in California should be conducted by two warring $50 million campaigns on the ballot, both of them putting out misleading information. You would think that if we had a competent state legislature, they would be able to address this issue the way it's supposed to be addressed. So you are not the only one who feels that way.
Okay, Dolores or David, you're next.
Unmute me. I did.
You're on mute.
Yes. Just a clarification. There were two propositions that were labeled as dealing with the Great Highway. There was Prop I that you identified, and then there was an unnamed proposition which you said just maintains the current procedures. What is the letter?
I and J.
I and J. Okay, that was my question.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions? Maybe we don't need a longer session with Tim. Okay,
There are
Betty.
a couple in the chat.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. And Betty, go ahead. We'll
Just
get
a
to those
quick
in
one. What is Tim's opinion, if he has one, on the city taking over the parking facility in the Golden Gate
Oh yeah,
Park?
good question. I didn't have time to get into that one, but I'm glad you did. Okay, so the problem with the museum parking facility is that it's really expensive. And a lot of people say, well, you can go in on 8th Avenue and you can park in the museum parking lot if you want to go to Golden Gate Park on the weekends with your family. And that way you don't have to drive on JFK Drive. The problem is it's really expensive. It's going to cost you like 25 or 30 bucks to park there all day for a family picnic. And a lot of people can't afford that. So the reason of that is that the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco and the entity that was created to build this garage 15 years ago controls the rates, right? So what this would do, essentially, this is the mayor's response to the warring ballot initiatives. The mayor's response is, let's have the city take over the parking garage and then the city can set the rates. So we can close JFK Drive, but the city can say, either everyone gets to park all day Saturday for $4, or if you're from a certain neighborhood, you get to park all day for whatever. The mayor and the supervisors will be able to set the parking rates in that garage. And that's all that's really about. Again, the museums don't like it because they get money from the parking garage, but that's what that's about.
Okay, the next question is coming from iPhone. What's your name, iPhone?
Is that me? I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand.
That's Karen.
Okay, Karen, go ahead.
Oh, it's iPhone. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I'm concerned. I understand that there are differences between the two housing measures, and I will probably vote for Chan's measure, but I'm concerned that even her measure sets affordable housing at 120%. And it just takes all the meaning out of it. It's deeply affordable housing that's needed. But when people hear affordable housing, they're going to start thinking these higher rates.
There's no question. All right. There's no question that both of these affordable housing measures, in my mind, are problematic. And here's why. All right. The state of California, in something called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which now has teeth, requires San Francisco over the next 8 years to facilitate the construction of roughly 80,000 new units of housing. Now, everyone says San Francisco needs to build more housing. This drives me nuts, partially because I was an editor for many years. Right? San Francisco doesn't build any housing at all. Right? San Francisco does not build housing. We used to in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, public housing was built by the city. The city doesn't build any housing at all. Private developers build housing. Right? Private for-profit developers build for-profit housing, and private nonprofit developers build affordable housing. Of those 80,000 units, almost 40,000 are supposed to be affordable. That is, when I say affordable, that means below market rate. Now, below market rate in the state of California and in the city and county of San Francisco can go as high as 120% of median. And what people who support that say is, well, 2 SFUSD teachers together make about 120% of median. A union electrician and a union teacher make about 120% of median, and they should be able to live here too. I'm going to set that aside for a second. That's a valid argument, but I'm going to set it aside for a second. The problem is the price, and this is not Tim Redmond, this is the city's own data. There was a hearing on this. The city's own data shows that it's going to cost about $2 billion a year, right? Roughly $19 billion over 8 years to subsidize those 40,000 units of affordable housing, no matter where we set the level. All right, even at 120% of median, which is only some of it. Most of the housing that the state wants us to build is way below that, is very low income and low income housing. All right. So where is that $19 billion going to come from? Gavin Newsom isn't giving it to us. So far, Joe Biden isn't giving it to us. And this entire discussion of streamlining affordable housing drives me crazy, because the problem, the roadblock to building affordable housing is not CEQA. It's not a appeal hearing at the Board of Supervisors. Those things are minor. The roadblock to building affordable housing is that $19 billion that we don't have, and that no one in the mayor's office, no one anywhere, no one in Gavin Newsom's office has put forward any plan whatsoever for how we're going to subsidize all of this housing. Right? So this idea that we're going to meet the RENA goals and housing prices are going to come down is nuts. There's 50,000 units of housing approved to be constructed today in San Francisco. Shovel ready. Those developers could break ground today. All approvals are done. There's no more red tape, no more appeals. Those are done. They're not building them. Why? Because capitalism works that way. Developers don't build housing because they want to build housing. They build housing, private developers, because there's a return on investment. And the return on investment in new housing in San Francisco isn't high enough now to satisfy the international speculative capital that finances housing. So housing isn't going to get built, right? None of these measures address that at all. So I understand your frustration. I understand the frustration with saying that that 120% of median isn't really affordable. I would say the difference is 120% of median is in fact market rate in many parts of town right now. That's what the amount that you'd have to pay under that standard is about what you have to pay for a 1-bedroom apartment anyway in the city, right? But there's a much bigger question than that on this, which is why both of these measures, I mean, if both of them pass, if one of them passes, if the other one passes, it's really not going to make a huge lot of difference. The YIMBY thing may pass with more votes than the Board of Supervisors won. It's not going to bring us more affordable housing until somebody comes up with where we're going to get that money from.
Okay, thank you, Tim. We have at least 2 more questions and one from me if we have time. So Tomasita, can you do it in 30 seconds or less?
Yes, just a point of information, the garage, the concourse, the money goes to pay off the loans that they've gotten to build the garage, and the museums don't get any of the money, and the museums are supporting actually, yes, on whatever it is for the garage. They're supporting it because it'll make it cheaper and more affordable for people. So
okay, good. All right, that's a good point. Clarification. At this point, they're still paying off the bonds. At a certain point, they will have paid off the bonds, and then that money will be available. But yes, this whole thing of how they set this up was nuts when they did it in the first place. So I'm glad the museums are supporting that to make it cheaper and more affordable for people to park, which of course will make it cheaper for them to go to the museums. So good.
Okay, Rob. Oh, Tim, were you finished?
No,
Yeah, I'm fine.
the Young Museum and the Academy, I mean the Legion of Honor, the 2 museums that are owned by the people of San Francisco, are free to residents of all 9 Bay Area counties every Saturday of the year for the last 3 years. That was instituted by the new guy that came in, which is very different than all my life, where it was only the first Wednesday of the month or the first Tuesday. Now it's every single Saturday, and it's both museums are free to everyone who lives in the Bay Area 9 counties. For your
Great. Fantastic. Not the case with the
Thanks,
Academy of
Melissa.
Sciences, but that's not owned by the city and county of San Francisco. So yes, thank you. And with any luck, we'll be able to park there for cheap for people who are mobility impaired, have trouble walking. We'll be able to park there and go to the museum for free on Saturday.
Okay, Robin, it's your turn.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about the road opening ones. I think in one of those propositions, the DPW is going to manage the Great Highway. I want to know if you have an opinion on that, as changing from the Park and Rec. Also, is it just going to be basically up to the voters as to whether they want access to their roads or whether they want the cars off the residential areas? Are we just going to see what the vote is, or do you have something to say about the safety issues out there
Sure.
with the cars in the Great Highway area?
This is a big, big issue. This does not include slow streets. The slow streets program that was put in place at the beginning of COVID, which some people really like and some people really hate, that's under the mayor's office and the supervisors, and that slow streets is not addressed in these ballot measures. The supporters of opening up the Great Highway do not like the Recreation and Parks Department. Right? They do not like Phil Ginsburg, who's the head of it, and they don't trust the Recreation and Parks Department because they see Rec Park as managing the Great Highway purely as a recreational facility and not as a road to get people from one place to another. All right. So that is why they moved it to DPW, which of course oversees and maintains other streets in the city. The idea being, let's not let Rec Park, who did this and closed it and cares only about bicycles and not about getting people around, run this. I don't trust Phil Ginsburg either, but I'm not sure that this is the best solution to the problem. Okay, so without getting into that debate, that is what that's about. That's why that's there.
Okay.
And I have a question for you. I don't think you covered any state ballot measures. Do you have any, is there anything important on the state ballot?
Yeah, well,
can defer that to our additional session of
I
Q&A with you.
talked about 26 and 27 because they're the ones that you're seeing all the TV ads on. That's the gambling stuff. All right, Proposition 1 is a constitutional amendment that would put reproductive rights in the California Constitution. All right, basically Prop 1 would make the right to reproductive choice a constitutional right in the state of California. This is a post overturn of Roe v. Wade measure that would basically say, no matter who's in the state legislature, no matter what happens on a national level, abortion is a right in California under the state constitution. I suspect that's going to pass pretty overwhelmingly. California has always been a big pro-choice state. There's an interesting one. Prop 30 is an increased tax on incomes of over $1 million, like a 2% tax on very high incomes to pay for wildfire preservation and firefighting. I'm generally not a big fan of these kinds of earmarked taxes, where you put a tax on the ballot and say it has to go exactly for one thing. But I'm in favor of taxing the rich under almost any circumstances, because as Thomas Piketty, the brilliant French economist who wrote Capital in the 21st century, says, taxing the wealthy is valuable in and of itself, no matter what you do with the money. So I'm in favor of taxing the rich anyway, even if you throw the money in the ocean. So that's an interesting one. There's, we're going to go through this Prop 29 fight about whether you have to have a licensed healthcare provider available in a dialysis center. That's on the ballot again. That's really the unions against the two monopoly companies that run all of dialysis in California. And the unions have been having a hard time organizing them. And they think that this is a way to push their agenda, and the dialysis centers, which are a horrible monopoly, are against it because it costs them extra money. Right. So that's another one that's on the state ballot. I could go into all of this in more detail if you want to have another session just on the state.
Okay, great. Okay, we have time for one final question. We have a minute left. Paul, can you make it short and the answer short?
Yeah, just a question on the open the park, open JFK Promenade, and open the Great Highway to cars full time. On the Great Highway standpoint, do you know, does that talk to that south of Sloat segment that is washing away?
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, because here's the problem. All right, the Great Highway folks think that we should widen. There's a narrow access road that goes kind of on the side of the zoo, south of Sloat, that can take you to 35. They would like to see that widened and kept open, because basically the bottom line is that section of the Great Highway south of Sloat that now takes you to Daly City Boulevard and Prop 30 and California 35 is going to be reclaimed by the ocean pretty soon anyway. The city can't maintain that. It's every winter it's covered with sand. The expense with rising sea levels of maintaining that is pretty much undoable. They can't. That section is going to have to be closed off. So, right, your question is very good. If we open the Great Highway to cars, but they have to stop at Sloat Boulevard anyway because the Great Highway closes there, and they can't get south, which is what a lot of people use the Great Highway for. For example, as I say, to get on 35 and go south, or to come the other way. For example, to come up from Daly City Boulevard, get on the Great Highway and go, for example, to Harding Park, which I do. All right, that's not going to be possible anymore. So that's another twist to this whole thing that is not addressed in the ballot measure. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, for that great presentation and answering the questions. And we will schedule a follow-up. So watch this space for another session with Tim Redmond. And now I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Jason McDaniel is an associate professor of political science at San Francisco State University. Professor McDaniel specializes in urban politics and voting behavior with an emphasis on contextual effects. His current research includes an exploration of racial contextual effects on voter turnout in San Francisco mayoral elections, an analysis of vote disqualifying ballot errors in San Francisco elections using instant runoff voting, and an analysis of the ways that neighborhood context influences vote choice. Professor McDaniel will give us an overview of the national political landscape for the midterms, and with control of Congress and maybe even our democracy hanging in the balance, what can we as citizens or activists do? Thank you. Go ahead, Professor McDaniel.
Thank you. Thank you, Art, and thank you to everyone here for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I do want to just follow up on that. The thing I care about the most is voter turnout in elections. It's what I study the most. And I want to emphasize something that Tim brought up just briefly, is that there's a big change potentially on the ballot in San Francisco to change when we have the elections, our elections to coincide with the presidential elections. And the people in my field, the political scientists study this. This is the number one thing you can do to increase voter turnout is to have elections, what we call on cycle with federal and state elections. San Francisco does a pretty good job of that now, but it would change to what Berkeley has done, which is to be presidential year elections. Turnout would increase dramatically. There's a lot of research on this and how it would change the composition of the electorate and who votes. I think one of the things it would do, and I think this is interesting, I suspect everyone here, supports higher voter turnout. And I think there is the perception, probably true, that more sort of progressive type voters will vote in these kinds of elections. I put a link to a report kind of talking about a lot of this research on how it will change the composition of the electorate most likely. It'll probably make it a younger electorate than we normally see. That's one thing to think about. And it'll also probably make it so that it affects perhaps the success of teachers' unions. When we look in California and nationwide, teachers' union endorsed candidates do less well on average in these presidential year elections. So again, these are things that are interesting, I think, from my point of view. They might be interesting to you. I wanted to emphasize that. I can talk about that later if you want, or what have you. It's actually a complicated issue, but it is, I think, an important one. And so there's a lot of things to think about. So I'm going to, as Art said, I'm going to talk about the sort of national picture. I'm going to share my screen here with everyone. I have some slides I put together on sort of taking a political science point of view, and I hope everyone can see that. So let me know if you can't see there, on what to expect for the the current congressional midterm election year, and then why. I want to really focus on the why part. And I took a lot of pictures from 538.com. They have some great stuff. This is where we are right now. These two pictures summarize pretty well, I think, where political scientists and experts think we are right now as of today. Republicans favored pretty heavily to win the House, take over the House of Representatives. Democrats have only a very narrow 4-seat advantage, I think, right now. And then, surprisingly to me somewhat, and this has changed in the last couple of weeks, probably Democrats are narrowly favored to keep control of the Senate right now. I have to say, though, my prior position is that we should probably expect before Dobbs. I don't think that was the case, and when people said that, I said that's unlikely. History tells us right now that almost every time there's what we call a midterm penalty in the congressional midterm elections, where the president's party loses seats and loses votes in the congressional election. So on average, since 1946, during midterm elections, the president's party loses 7.4 points of vote share from the presidential election 2 years before to the congressional elections, the midterm elections. That's a lot. So it's 7 points on average. Democrats had a 3-point advantage, a very narrow advantage that still only gave them a 4-seat majority, advantage in the House. That would, if history holds in some, narrow way, that would say a 4.3-point advantage to the Republicans. And given some of the gerrymandering issues, that would give them an easy win. That would be a pretty big change there. What you're seeing, I want to point out there, is there's only one election where the president's party did not or gained vote share from the election before to the midterm election, and that was 2002. And that was George Bush being highly high approval ratings at that time, unlike at the beginning of his term, and did not win the majority of the vote share or win a popular vote share in 2000, and to be incredibly popular, sort of over popular from what we saw. He started out at only around 50%, shot up to in the 90s. So quite an exemption or exception there. In terms of seat share, right? Only 2 elections, and in modern terms, especially where the president's party gained seats in the House. Again, 2002, interestingly, 1998, again, Bill Clinton, very high approval ratings, in the 60s during this one. I think there was the sense of the overreach of the Gingrich Republican House, especially when it came to impeachment. But still, on average, 26 seats lost by the president's party. What I was telling people earlier this year is that Democrats' best hope was to avoid a 2010 wipeout, a 1994, 2010 scale wipeout. We might be in a more optimistic scenario for Democrats now, is what I would say. Part of that optimism is that the president's party does not always lose seats in the Senate. Usually does, but not always. So I think this tells us why we should, despite a lot of things, I expect Republicans will win the House. If Republicans do not win the House, that is a big deal. That'll be an exception, a historically rare event, and we'll talk about why that might be the case. But holding on to the Senate, I think, is something that Democrats can do. It will still be difficult. I think we should not think that it's likely. I think it's still, if I had to bet, I would bet on Republicans taking the Senate. But there is some reason to think that might not happen. That's where I am right now. Why does this happen? And this is where I want to bring some political science to bear. Why does the president's party almost always, almost like clockwork, lose seats in the first midterm election or in midterm elections in general? And I'm going to boil this down to 2 basic answers. One is what we call differential turnout. There's this idea that presidents win, there's a surge of turnout opposing the sort of party, maybe the previous president in an open seat especially, that Democrats surged in 2020 to oppose Trump. When they're out of power, there's a lot of mobilization, a lot of feelings of to get that president out of power, and then it declines, it recedes in that first 2 years. After a president wins, their partisans, the Democratic Party in this case, sort of feels like they did the job, and then they kind of decline just a little bit, while at the same time, the out party now, the Republicans, get super mobilized, super energized, super enthusiastic to try to, again, defeat that president that they feel they have to really work hard to beat. So this cycle that we see every couple of years of surge and then decline on one side, and then a surge of counter mobilization on the other side, that just seems to be really baked in deeply to people. No matter people like us, I think people who pay attention to politics, who attend these kinds of meetings, we may feel that that's the case. We're people who vote in every election just about, but that's not everybody, and that's not the most people or what have you. And so there is this sort of almost inevitable decline in turnout that seems to explain a lot of this. It does seem to explain a lot of this. I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. But another part of this, and maybe perhaps the bigger part of this, is this thing that I'm going to call a governing penalty. The president's party is penalized for doing their job or doing the things that they say they're going to do, or on the other hand, not doing things that they say they're going to do. I think we can think about it that way. Let me show you the next slide here. This is from a recent a newsletter, an article published in The Economist by a political, I'll call him a political scientist. He was an undergraduate at the University of Texas in political science. He's very talented, named G. Elliott Morris. And this is historically, what we see is that parties generally, but Democrats especially, are punished for passing laws. And this is something when I tell students about this, it really depresses people, right? And maybe people like us here in this idea that when Democrats pass laws, and we can count the number of sort of laws that are coded as liberal, they are more penalized in the vote share at the next House elections. And, you know, on the one hand, I can imagine politicians being incredibly frustrated by that. Like I governed on saying I'm going to do these things. I did them. I want to celebrate my achievements, and then they're penalized for it. Now they're not necessarily penalized by their own party. I think it feeds into this idea that, you know, Republicans, for instance, or maybe independent leaning Republicans, or, you know, quote unquote moderates. I don't love that phrase, but quote unquote moderates. They then are mobilized by the passage of these laws to then get out there and vote. So I think these are combined together, these explanations somewhat. And then there's also this thing that it's sort of a balancing thing, which people like us who are maybe liberals and progressives, and, you know, largely in San Francisco and in this, you know, this meeting especially, there seems to be this thing that a significant portion of the American electorate, probably ones that pay less attention to politics, they feel a kind of knee-jerk, oh, things are happening, we need to slow it down. We need to, you know, balance it out, right? So, oh, there's all these liberal laws that are passing. Great. No, they sort of said like, oh, maybe it's too much. And it's sort of this like what we call a thermostat in political science. It's like, oh, it's really hot. Let's turn off the heat. And, oh, it's cold again. Let's turn the heat on. And we see it like a cycle, you know, and it's not really very, it can be frustrating because it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, right? Voters in general, and I don't mean every voter, but the electorate as a whole seems to tend more to punishing parties for passing policies and moving policy in one direction or the other rather than rewarding them. And it's really frustrating for politicians. And I don't know if all activists really understand this. And it's really difficult. It's one of the things political scientists really have a hard time, you know, not understanding, but like talking about, because it can be, I think from my point of view, it can be so depressing. For others, you know, I think it's good. It's a balancing, moderation kind of sweet, you know, kind of thing. I don't love that idea. I think politicians should be rewarded for passing good policy and, you know, punished for doing a bad job. And this sort of seems to bake in a little bit of an advantage for a party, especially right now, a Republican Party that is not interested in governing or passing policy, right? So I think it's sort of something that kind of advantages them a little bit, which is, I think, too bad. So this governing penalty idea is really deeply baked in to American politics in a way that I think is hard to change, and so we should expect it. It's sort of why we see these midterm penalties happening. Where are we at right now? Look, if you want to know what's going to happen in a midterm election, it's almost always the case. Look at the presidential approval rating, right? So I think Biden is seeing a governing penalty. I think that change starts happening, you know, last summer. That green line, you start to see the polls. His approval ratings, you know, dips sharply. I think, has to do with Afghanistan, but it has to do with inflation and the economy. But it also had to do with a lot of you know, talking about the agenda, the Build Back a Better agenda, that being in the news. And then also, I think the failure of that agenda. So Democrats, you know, start, you know, losing some enthusiasm. Not a lot, but it goes from 88, 90% approval to 75, 70% approval amongst Democrats for Biden, right? That's a huge change. That's a lot of what we saw there. And then it gets worse because of the economy and because of inflation. I say that it really is the case that you can track presidential approval almost entirely with how well the economy is doing and how inflation is doing. It's not an oversimplification almost to say that. That uptick you see recently, I think, there has been some good news. And I think you're seeing that amongst Democrats. Inflation, you know, seems to be ameliorating a little bit, passing some laws. So Biden's approval rating is ticking up, but not even close to being where it would need to be to expect Democrats to do well in House elections. On the other hand, the current congressional generic ballots are neck and neck, and that's a change. And if you look at that closely, what you see is for most of this year, Republicans were leading in the congressional ballot, and a small Republican lead would be expected to grow over the next year, and we'd see pretty much of a wave election. I think Republicans seem to need a little bit less of an advantage to win a lot of seats than Democrats do. And so right now, the fact that Democrats are even on average, and some polls showing them higher, that's a big deal. And probably not enough to keep the House, honestly. From what I understand from people that are saying this, if you think about the last election, Democrats won by 3 points, and they barely eked out a majority. So that's I think gerrymandering. It's Democrats seem to need to win by 4 to 5 points to really get a majority in the House. Is that going to happen? Maybe, right? I think it's possible that what we're seeing right now is potentially the governing penalty might be affecting Republicans, oddly enough. All the attention, especially to Dobbs, and in the states, I think is possibly leading people to kind of, somewhat counteract this governing ideological moderation penalty that I mentioned before. And it's also potentially mobilizing Democrats. So are we in a situation where something might be different? Now, let me say this slide and then I'll go to that. So some people might say, well, Democrats can do better over the rest of this year until November. What this graph shows you, this is from an article published a while ago, but the black lines are Democratic presidents and the gray lines, the dashed lines, are Republican presidents. And what you see is that, so this is like vote share against Democrats going down, vote share for Democrats going up on the slide, that when there are Democratic presidents, the closer we get to the election, the worse the generic ballot is for Democrats. It's almost all moving that way. Republicans is the same thing, only not quite as much, but the closer to the election, the worse it is for the generic ballot for Republican candidates. So we should probably expect that to change. So again, as a political scientist, I would say right now this sort of good news that we've been seeing lately with Biden's approval rating and the generic ballot favoring Democrats, I would say the gravity, so to speak, of this kind of graph would lead us to think more declines as we get closer to the election. It's not inevitable, but that's where I would bet if I was betting, right? Now, what about Dobbs? I was asked a couple of months ago to talk to some people on TV about this, and I said, I doubt it will change things. But we've seen some reasons to think that I was wrong about that. How will it change it, right? That's the key. It's turnout, right? It needs to mobilize people who normally do not vote in midterm elections. Young people, less college-educated people, Latino voters, African-American voters, Asian American voters, especially younger African-American, younger Asian voters. What we see here, and we saw this in Kansas, and I'm sure you guys have heard about this, but these are graphs from the Catalyst group, which is a Democratic-leaning political science polling data science kind of operation, a consultant operation. Thank you. I'll finish. I'm almost done here. So what you're seeing here is that the turnout in this election, that green line on the left, almost reached general election levels and surpassed some general elections, which is pretty amazing. And then the Democratic, the usual Republican advantage on turnout, that's the graph on the right, at 0% is like no advantage for either party. That green line shows us for the first time in memory, according to the Catalyst, data, Democratic advantage, turnout advantage surpassed Republicans, and that surpasses even the 2018 election. So in 2018, that green line and that blue line hit each other. That was amazing. That's a blue wave election in 2018, and man, it surpassed it even more this time around, right? So we need to see turnout beyond 2018 levels. 2018 was the biggest midterm election turnout nationally I've seen in basically in my memory, and according to a lot of the data. And that was what Trump did. Trump motivated Democrats to vote against him. He also motivated Republicans to vote for him, right? Does Dobbs have that same kind of ability, right? And if it does, we might see something different this time. New registrations right now, there's a lot of evidence that it's favoring women, and Democrats are more likely to be registering right now than men and Republicans. Democrats might be getting enthused. That might be enough to change things. Can this reverse the governing penalty? Right, that's the key. It's not certain. I probably would bet against it. This might fade away over the next few months, but maybe not, right? And then finally, I'll say this, extremist candidates are penalized in elections, in midterm elections. And this, I won't go through this graph, I only have 30 seconds, but more extreme candidates and more inexperienced candidates are penalized in congressional elections. There's a lot of political science on this, and Republicans seem to be nominating more ideologically extreme, more inexperienced candidates. So these are the things that might change a little bit about what we'd expect. I still would expect Republicans to have a good year this year, but there are some reasons I think Democrats might be able to change things. And I'll open things up. I'll go over to Alice and then we can do questions more later. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor McDaniel. So we're going to defer questions until after Alice Smith speaks. So you might want to write down any thoughts or try to remember them for later, for that Q&A at about 2:15.
I was not feeling
So-
good.
And sorry about that interruption. Our next speaker is Alice Schaefer Smith. She's founded the National Voter Corps in November 2016 after watching voter suppression deny citizens their right to vote. National Voter Corps is a national nonpartisan umbrella organization, 501c3 under the Social Good Fund, which connects volunteers with nonpartisan organizations to fight voter suppression and works toward 100% voter participation. Reclaim Our Vote's National Voter Corps volunteers started a California committee for Reclaim Our Vote, which resulted in writing thousands of letters and making phone calls to disenfranchised voters in states such as Georgia, Alabama, and North Carolina. Alice will give us a brief background on voting rights and then what actions people can take. She'll show what the Supreme Court and states have done to voting rights and why people have to get HR 5746 onto the Senate floor for voting on it now. Thank you. Go ahead, Alice.
Can you see my slide?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry, I put down, I thought I shared it. Just a minute, let me share
I want
screen.
to click on screen sharing.
Did
Make sure you.
can you see my, I'm clicking on share the screen. You're not seeing it?
No, we're not seeing it. Maybe you can go ahead without it unless you can get it on there.
No, I want to, my screen it makes a difference. You cannot see that.
No. Anybody else?
It's a
No.
two-step process. After clicking screen share, you have
There
to
you
pick
go.
what
There it
what
is.
window.
There it is.
Now we got it.
Okay, I got it.
Well,
Sorry about that.
Thank you. It's okay.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, especially after these two extremely competent speakers. I'd like to go at lightning speed to look at the rise and fall of voting rights in America, especially the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And you can all receive copies of this short version and the long version. I posted already in the chat if you got on time in early, www.nationalvotercorps.org, and you can go up and get slides and presentations. What I want to do is, sorry, I can't silence people, so I don't know.
We'll take care of it. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. What is going on here? Okay, so first of all, states control voting unless Congress otherwise acts, and that's in the Constitution. But it's Article 1.4 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to set times, places, and manner of holding elections for U.S. senators and representatives. Now, U.S. senators were originally controlled by state legislatures. And the 10th Amendment, I want to remind you, says that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited to the states, such as customs at the state borders, are reserved to the states specifically or to the people. The history behind voting rights, and I'm not going to take you through the history of voting rights, except to say that the Civil War was, of course, important, the Reconstruction period, and then the whole movement until finally women had the vote, and then 1965, after the Civil Rights Act was put in place. So the 14th Amendment
was passed in 1868, as you may remember, that it grants the right of citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States are citizens. And they are also offered equal protection. The 15th Amendment then said the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That needed to be passed because they still weren't allowing Blacks to vote. And there are various voting rights that have come in and gone out. For example, only the Chinese American lost their right to vote and become citizens in 1882. Native Americans could vote if they denounced their tribes, and they had to be men. There was actually a Supreme Court decision in 1875 that said that although women are citizens, that does not grant them the right to vote. And Alabama, by example, in 1901 said that you could not vote unless you paid all the taxes that you owed, in other words, a poll tax, in order to vote. So in the 20th century, you saw a bunch of amendments. You should all have a copy of the Constitution. I'm not going to go through them all. You can see them on the screen. But the most important thing that happened was that in 1965, there was a Voting Rights Act passed. And you'll recall that this happened after the death of Emmett Till and so many others in order to fight for the right to vote. And what was important about this act was that it said that there could be no voting qualification or prerequisite to vote, or standard practice or procedure could be imposed by a state to deny or abridge the right to vote, and particularly on account of race or color. And that was then amended later by various amendments to help with language and other parts of the Voting Rights Act. But there was a formula that was associated with discrimination in Section 4. And in Section 5, they required pre-clearance by the Justice Department or a federal court in order to change any precinct, voting policy, anything in states that met the criteria, which is the pre-segregation cases, the places where segregation had been profound before 1965. Let me just show you why the pre-clearance requirement of the federal court and the Justice Department was important. Mississippi's Black voters went up from 6% in 1965 to 59% of the voters in Mississippi by 1969, simply because of the Voting Rights Act and the procedures and policies that were put in place by the Justice Department. Excuse me, Congress had only 6 Blacks in 1965, but 13 by 1971. No senators in 65, 1 Black by 1971. The Justice Department reviewed 4,500 to 5,000 claims of voter discrimination a year. And they reviewed policies and procedures into the thousands before anything was authorized to be changed, so that in fact, voting rights happened. And there have been favorable changes, by example, only the motor voter law, and in 1993, they put in the Voter Registration Act, which said that you could only ask for 4 digits of your social security number or your state ID or your state license plate number or driver's license in order to vote. And these were extremely important because the southern states suddenly started having voter registration requirements that were terrifically harassed to stop Blacks from voting. Let's be clear, this was to stop Blacks and students and people who were liberals from voting. Then you had Citizens United. The Supreme Court, in its wisdom, decided that corporations were people, and therefore unions and corporations put an untoward amount of money into the ballot box, completely skewing one person, one vote, and every vote counted. because it allowed for advertising, and lying in advertising is not, I guess it's free speech, don't ask me, but they were terrible things that happened. And it started in 2010. These are the states that were covered by the preclearance requirement under section 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And notice that purple, or I don't know, brown, whatever color you want to call that, is what was, the whole state was covered. Red was county, including 4 in California, because they had a history, and the formula showed that they discriminated against people of color. In California, it happened to be against Latinx. And pink were townships, and there were many townships that had discriminatory processes, and these were being controlled by the federal Justice Department or the federal courts. And then in came Shelby County. You've heard of Shelby County. It made section 4 unconstitutional. And the basis of it was, and this is Roberts, and you must be mindful of this. Roberts said that federalism and equal sovereignty of the states was more important than a 40-year-old formula that was out of date. By the way, in 2006, the Voting Rights Act had been renewed by, I believe, 92 votes of the Senate, passed a 25-year extension to the Voting Rights Act. And the famous expression by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, where she said, throwing out preclearance when it was worked and continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And she was so true. The immediate impact, 1,688 polling places in the covered districts were removed. They had 35 states, sorry, let me just close this. 35 states had added stricter voter ID laws. Look at where they are located, pink and red. 30 million voters purged because they had either been inactive or didn't vote the year before, or there were a cross-check, there were all kinds of reasons, but they were mostly impacting Black and Chicano or Latinx voters. Then by 2021, after Biden was elected, more restricted voting laws came in, and these you can see are in the pink. Expanded were the green, shouldn't surprise you where they're located, but in both expanded and contracted are the yellow. In 2021, the Supreme Court attacked Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in Brenovich versus the Democratic National Committee, because they stopped the right to collect in Arizona on native territories where people live 300 miles away from their ballot box to deliver to the precinct the votes, and they stopped counting votes from people who voted in the wrong precinct. In California, you can vote in the wrong precinct. The registrar of voters goes through and alters and copies your ballot, so all those things that are relevant to a specific precinct are removed and all the rest of the ballot is counted. The 19th Circuit Court here in San Francisco found by 7-4 that this was an unlawful discrimination under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act because it was a discriminatory impact on Native Americans. But the US Supreme Court, in its wisdom, found that this was not a true dilution of the right to vote. We have a problem. The problem is that voting rights have been battered since 2010 by the US Supreme Court, hurting minorities, particularly by the Supreme Court, and 19 state legislatures have had all kinds of legislation. If you're not aware of it, go to the Brennan Center for Justice to get the facts. But political gerrymandering was one case. Another case, the Supreme Court, which found it lawful because the US Supreme Court could not say that it was unlawful, as Justice Kagan kindly pointed out, under the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and the First Amendment. They couldn't find that. No, Roberts said that it's not up to the Supreme Court to overrule state legislatures, which are sovereign, unless Congress acts. And Congress hadn't acted on gerrymandering under Article 1.4 of the Constitution, and therefore the Supreme Court was going to be silent. The solution, I have a solution. My solution is what the House of Representatives did to ensure that every zip code in America shares the same election laws for times, place, and manner. It's called HR 5746. It was passed by the House of Representatives with no Republicans voting for it. And it stalled in the Senate when Sinema and Manchester determined that it was more important to protect the filibuster than it was to protect the right to vote. By chance, I met with Manchester's staff the next day on a presentation that had been planned to get him to support the vote. His staff said that for Manchester, the filibuster was more important than voting rights. So what is the filibuster? It's not in the Constitution. It is simply what the US Supreme Court has said, I'm sorry, what the Senate failed to adopt a rule to have a simple majority to stop a debate. And it was first used in 1839, and it has been used. It has been waived now for budget reconciliation for the federal executive positions for the cabinet and things, and Supreme Court nominations. And look, when they stopped the filibuster, 2017, that was McConnell's great joy. And why not voting rights? Because voting rights are civil rights, and the Republicans are not supporting civil rights. So they in the past history, it was used to prevent anti-lynching bills, Fair Employment Practices Bill, an amendment to abolish the Electoral College, and now the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act of 2022. I have 30 seconds left. Fine. What I want you to do is I want you to look at these slides, because what we have is, this is what we want you to call the White House, call your senators, and then go to every one of your friends who live in these states and get them to call their US senators and their state legislators to support progressive voting rights. Do not let this get away. We need to act now. Consider the brave people in the Ukraine who are dying for the right of a democracy. We in the United States need to protect our rights to stand up for voting rights now. I overran my time. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Alice. Can you stop screen sharing so I can see everybody on the?
Sure. Okay. And those are the films that you can go look at if you don't understand what I was doing.
And you said that you could share this with everybody.
I'll put them up in the chat, or I'll send you the slides. Why don't I send you, Art?
You can send it out. And also, can you repost that information you had in the chat earlier so people can get it?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. Now it's time for Q&A for Alice and Professor McLean. So if you have a question, I see we already have one. Raise your hand using the reaction button, and or raise your hand like this. Okay, Tim, go ahead. Tim Redmond. You have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
I got you. Thank you. Professor McDaniel, Jason, glad to be on the program with you. I think it might be really helpful for the folks here if you could give some insight into which of the Senate races are most likely to be the turning point, which ones are most likely to hold the key to whether the Democrats win the Senate, so that if people here want to donate money or get involved, it's clearly not California, right? So which would you say are the 2 or 3 most pivotal US Senate races that people who care about these things could get involved in or give money to?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And I actually think the best thing we can do is focus on Senate races right now, right? As you say, and I mean donations, and that means calling and helping do voter mobilization efforts. And it's Georgia and Pennsylvania in my mind, and there's a couple of others, but it's those two that if Warnock can win in Georgia, that is, I mean, look, the reason we have the legislation we had this year and the Supreme Court justice we had this year and what have you is worn out, right? Is the Georgia election in 2020 and what happened there. If he manages to hold on and beat Herschel Walker, which the polls are showing him ahead right now, that's a huge deal. Fetterman seems to be doing a good job against Oz in Pennsylvania, but those are the races. I think try to avoid giving money to sort of candidates that might be challenging, high-profile Republicans in Republican districts, right? I think there's sometimes a mistake we do as a sort of, let's think of it as broadly the Democratic left and liberals. We support a lot of candidates. I'm remembering someone, was their name McGrath, who was challenging someone in Kentucky. Was she challenging McConnell or somebody in Kentucky? Got a ton of money, and she was a great candidate, but it was a waste of money. Right. And it's these close house races. Find some that are, if you've got family nearby or if they're nearby here or what have you, and those Senate races, Arizona and Nevada. Thank you, Alice, for mentioning those. It's, Senate wise, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, those four, that could be the whole ball of wax. And to speak to about the filibuster, I do think that if there are a few more Democratic senators, they will very much consider ending the filibuster for voting rights and for abortion rights. And so I would speak to someone who talked about the idea of progressives being disappointed in Biden and the Democratic agenda. I don't blame anybody for being disappointed, but that is part of why I think we see the governing penalty and that demobilization is that people all across the spectrum find some reason to be disappointed. And what's happening, I think, now is that we need to find reasons not to be disappointed. Right. And if that means that it's just about the Republicans being worse than the Democrats, then fine. But this is incredibly important. And the way in which the Republican Party has become anti-democratic, and I did not used to say that, it really has, is really important. Val Demings in Florida has a chance. I think it's unlikely, but she has a chance. I would give money to some of those other candidates before I gave money to Val Demings, even though she's a great candidate. Taking on a relatively popular incumbent in Rubio. It's like Ted Cruz versus Beto, last time around. They may seem unpopular and not very good, but it's really difficult to beat an incumbent senator who's won before. It's just really difficult. So those open seats are where it's at, really. If you want to maximize the amount of your money and your contributions and your time and your effort, and I'll shut up now. Tim, thank you for the question, Tim.
Are there other questions from the audience? Okay, Alice, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I just had a quick question. There was a special election in Michigan where the candidate for Congress, I believe the Trumpite, reduced his margin by 6%. That was a much closer call, and people were seeing that as an indication that the Democrats and the 18 to 35-year-olds who usually sit on their bloody hands actually got out and voted.
Yeah, special elections is something that insider types, it's one of those leading indicators they look at. And earlier this year, when we had special elections to fill congressional seats, Republicans were doing quite well. They were exceeding their margins from the 2 years ago. That's changed, and it's changed especially in the last month or two. And you're pointing to one of those where, although the Republican won in that race, the margin was much less than what it was, the last time around, and what you would expect in a strong Republican year. So we see that in many places, several places where the special elections, not to mention the ballot initiatives like in Kansas, are starting to look good for Democrats. It's a sign that it's unusual. It's an unusual kind of thing. Usually you see these things pick up over time. By now, I would be expecting Republicans, if we were in a Republican wave year, to really be winning those. I don't think that's happening right now. That's good news for Democrats, but I will say this. It's a long time to the election, and it doesn't seem like that to maybe us, but it is. And what feels important now, it is amazing the ability of people to forget and just find reasons not to vote. And so it has to keep happening. It has to keep happening, right? And that's hard to do. But I will say this, there was an article in the New York Times recently about Republicans spending, or Democrats spending $40 million on ads about abortion, about Dobbs, where Republicans are not spending. That issue, they're trying to keep that issue salient, and that issue is salient in the special elections. It's important for governor's elections and senators' elections, right? So it is very possible that Dobbs is going to change things. It's not the sort of MAGA Trump thing necessarily. It's Dobbs and abortion that really has the ability to possibly change this around.
Okay, we have some more questions. Before we go into those, I just want to point of personal privilege. This issue is near and dear to my heart. The Great Panthers, we've been doing a lot of work to get ourselves organized. We have activism leaders on Laguna Honda Hospital. I'm trying to do that with voting rights. So we'll publicize our new website when it's ready to go. But please stay in touch with me if you're concerned, as I am, that this election is no ordinary election. We're facing the threat of fascism, in my opinion, and that we cannot regard this as an ordinary business as usual kind of election period. The more people that get active and do what they can, the better. And we've got some things posted in the chat, like Voter Corps that Alice represents. They have a wonderful list of national groups who support voting rights, and they're clickable. So go to the chat and scroll up to 2:09 p.m. You'll see Voter Corps, get involved nationally, and click on that link. Indivisible, they're all over the country and they're working hard. Seed the Vote. If you scroll down, you'll see Seed the Vote information. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of efforts around the country who representing the same concern that I have, that we have an unprecedented threat to our democracy. And it's not just a spectator sport. We have to rise beyond where we've been in the past, even if we've been active in the past. So now go ahead, Diana, your turn.
Yeah, this is to Alice. Alice, you've previously spoken about to get the Senate to pass reform the filibuster, it had to happen before their break. It's past that time now. If we get active, where would you focus? What states would have the advantage of switching votes if we can't cover all of them or think of people in all of them?
Well, first I would go to Portman because he's not running for re-election and he is actually an honorable man. So I would go to him. He's in Ohio and I would speak to him. And I would go to Murkowski because she actually has a conscience, I believe, at least better than most. I would also go to Romney because he also has a conscience, even though he comes from a state which is pretty conservative, but he does actually stand up for some things that are morally just. And I would go back to Manchin and Sinema. I wouldn't give them up. They have actually come back to do a few things that are right. And the final person that I would go to is Collins, although Collins is from a state that actually has very strong voting rights. You don't agree with that, Jason?
Sorry, I yes, I'm loving them, but it's not going to happen until the filibusters change, and they're not going to change the filibuster.
Okay,
and so yeah,
I'm not
I know
convinced.
what you're talking about. Yeah.
I'm not convinced.
They won't vote. They will not vote to overturn a filibuster.
But you have said
they might
that
vote on the final passage. They might vote on final passage.
Okay, one person at a time, and we're running down to the end of our time. So I'd like to give Robin a quick opportunity to ask a quick question. Matthew Holtz, can each of you just make it really quick? Robin, go ahead.
Okay, I guess this question is for Jason. The abortion issue is huge. How do you see that affecting the political landscape in the next year?
Sorry, and the question was, I didn't quite hear the question.
Yeah, the abortion issue is huge. The country is split, states for it, states against it. So how is this going to affect the political races this year, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because, the country is split in some ways, but I think there are pretty strong majorities in favor of keeping policy sort of the way it was so to speak, you know, that kind of a simple thing of like, and this has made people aware that policy is being changed, right? And a lot of Republicans are pushing policy change. So I do think overall the issue of abortion is going to help Democratic candidates this time around. I think we've lived in a time where the issue of abortion largely was one that was brought up by Republicans, and they use it to mobilize their supporters for the last, 40 years at least, right? I think this is starting to change. And so you're seeing Democratic candidates talking about it. It's now sailing to them because the policies change, right? And so I think it's going to be an advantage for Democrats, but there needs to be a lot of work in terms of money spent on campaigns and voter turnout and media messaging to get that out there amongst people, to the voters. Yeah.
We're down to our last minute. Matthew, can you make it quick?
Sure. People talk about Biden and his approval ratings, and yet it's hardly ever mentioned that, in fact, he's polling better than all the Republicans, including Trump. Now, in 2001, the country was attacked, and it benefited George W. Bush in 2002. The country was attacked on January 6th. Does this bode well for Biden?
It hasn't boded well for his approval rating. Yeah, it hasn't boded well for his approval ratings. The thing is that Biden's not running, on the ballot, and many of the candidates are not either. I mean, even the congressional candidates, it just doesn't matter. People seem to, treat these elections as referendums on the incumbent president. Right. And his approval ratings are just not that high right now. They don't perceive it. At least a lot of the company doesn't perceive January 6th to be the kind of attack that, uniting. I mean, look, I give Democrats credit for sort of uniting behind presidents, even in, Republican presidents. We don't see that very much with Republican people uniting behind Democrats too much these days. Right. So it's just not going to matter to the election. I still think, the January 6th events do matter in the sense of they're important, not only how they affect an election, but actually, getting, the truth out there and perhaps leading to some indictments and to make it less likely that Republicans do this again, right? So I've really been pleased with what happened with the January 6th committee, but I don't think we should expect that to help be good for Democrats in the election. And in fact, I think Democrats want to de-emphasize that a little bit. Democrats think that issues like healthcare and abortion are going to be helping them. They don't want to talk about Trump and January 6th, not because they don't care about it, but because they don't think voters care about those things as much. Listen to Pelosi, listen to Biden, listen to Democratic candidates. They talk about healthcare, they talk about abortion, they're going to talk about inflation. Those are the things that they think help them. And Social Security, those are the things that help them.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask the final two questioners to put your questions in the chat? And I would ask the panelists to notice what goes in the chat. Maybe you could answer them through the chat, but we have to end this meeting. We have a half hour at the end of our time until 3 o'clock to devote to the membership meeting. And I'm sorry we didn't allocate enough time for the program.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, but I really want to thank Tim Redmond, Jason McDaniel, and Alice Smith for speaking to us and answering questions. And we're very happy you came and helped us think about these very important issues. And we recorded the meeting. If anybody wants a recording, we have some of the transcript. We didn't start till about 20 minutes in. But if you want the transcript, if you want the video, put your email address in the chat and we can send it to you. And any other comments or questions are fine. We'll do our best to answer them. Okay, so if you want to stay past this point, it's going to be a SF Gray Panther membership meeting. And we're going to be giving the members an opportunity to interact with the board, get their questions answered, raise concerns. I've got a list of suggested approaches to the board. So is there anything in the news you want to talk about? Are there any upcoming meetings or events you want to announce? Do you want to suggest other areas of activism for the SF Gray Panthers? Do you want to know what others have worked on since the last meeting? Do you want to share with us any activism in which you've been involved lately? Do you have an idea for an upcoming meeting? So please feel to put any of this in the chat or raise your hand and ask any questions of the board you care to, or make any comments you care to. And procedure is the same as before. raise your hand and do that by the reaction button or raising your hand physically, or put something in the chat. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody for coming, and now we're going to take questions and comments from the members. First of all, I want to give any board members who are still here a chance to say something. I know that Dr. Palmer is still here, and at 4 o'clock today, there's going to be a San Francisco Health Commission meeting where they're taking public comment. So Terry, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, here, I'm trying to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, basically, Laguna Honda is just turning into kind of an ongoing issue where the city and the feds and the state are working together. All of this never should have happened, but it did. And there's been a reprieve has been given for closure and discharges until November 13th. So the feds are going to continue to pay the Medicare and Medi-Cal bills at Laguna Honda until November 13th, and no one's going to have to be forcibly discharged, but at least people who are qualified for nursing home beds. But recertification will not occur and new admissions will not be allowed until the first quarter of 2023. So now the question is, what's going to happen in those 3 months? Are people going to get forced out? Are they going to try to close the institution? And the other thing that's going on is the feds have demanded a downsize of 120 beds in this almost new institution because of some newer COVID rules. And the reason is that Laguna Honda lost its certification and has to recertify. So there's a lawsuit also about that going on. But the health department is going on and trying to cut the licensure for these beds, and that needs to be protested against. We can't afford to lose any beds at Laguna Honda. We can't afford for people to be forcibly discharged because there's nowhere for them to go. And we need to preserve all the beds for the aging people of San Francisco that might one day need it. And the city has to fund adequate behavioral and mental health programs instead of just sending people to nursing homes because they don't know what to do with them, which is what happened to a lot of these folks. As you know, jails and nursing homes are now becoming the default places where you send people with mental illness and substance use that you don't know what to do with. And it's hard on the people themselves who may not do well in that institution. And it's hard on the other residents of the institution who are frail and very vulnerable. This is what I'm going to testify about it for. There's call-in instructions that are on the agenda for the health department if you go on the web. And I've sent instructions to everyone that we know. If you don't have them, you can text me at 415-260-8446. And I can give you the call-in instructions to defend Laguna Honda. It's agenda item number 7, so it'll take a little while to come up, but usually the health department, the health commission meetings go pretty quickly.
So Terry, that's the San Francisco Health Commission. They meet today at 4 p.m. You can be there in person or by phone or by WebEx. And is there any way you could post any information about how to connect with them in the
yeah,
chat?
I'll do that right away in the chat. Okay,
Great.
I'll do that right away.
Are there any other board members who want to have a say before we let the members ask us questions or make comments? I see that we have Matthew here, Michael Lyon, Karen Fishkin, and myself. So we just heard from Dr. Teresa Palmer, who is our newest board member. Not hearing anything from other board members. I did mention we're working on getting our website up and running with activism leaders. And that should be going public fairly soon, I believe. And it's something that we can edit ourselves. And if you have an issue that you want to work on actively and be an activism leader on that issue, you can get your own web page on our website, subject to board approval, of course, but that's an option. Okay, do we have any other board members who want to say anything, or do we have comments or questions from those remaining on this Zoom?
Well, this is Anne. I just want to say I'm here and enjoying the meeting, Art. So we have a full board.
Yeah, I didn't recognize your phone ID. Anne is a fellow board member, and
I wonder.
and there's Terry.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. I just muted you, Terry. Sorry. So thanks for being here, Anne, and I'm glad you spoke up so I recognize that you're here. Are there any questions or comments from?
I just say something about the website. We're hoping to go live at this rate. We're going in September. It's been a painful process because we're trying to do an integrated website where we can spend time on the activism and not on the bookkeeping. But it really is important to have people who are experts in different areas that we're all interested in making a difference in, contribute to what we call our activism pages. And if you have an area that you're passionate about and you have the discipline to update something on the web once a week about what's going on, the board would welcome your participation in our website.
Yeah, and it's not that difficult because even I can do it. We have instructions on how to post and edit things on this website. It's become something that's doable.
We're designing a user-friendly, idiot-proof website that is easy to edit, easy to put things on.
We're also continuing to send out our emails to those who have indicated an interest in being members or who are members. So if you are a member, you should be getting these emails, and let us know if you're not. And if you want to get our emails, just put your name in the chat and your email address, and we'll be happy to add you, because we let our members know about things that we're interested in being active on, and events, hearings. Laguna Honda is a good example. We've had a lot of activism around Laguna Honda recently, and it's I think we and other people in San Francisco have had an effect, I think, in making this situation, bringing our concerns to light. The politicians are having to respond to those concerns, and it's getting news coverage even. But Terry is a geriatrician. She's a good example of an activism leader because she is a geriatrician. She worked at Laguna Honda Hospital. She's active on it now to make sure that it doesn't get shut down and patients aren't transferred inappropriately. There have been some deaths, and these are probably unnecessary deaths. And when there was a hearing at the Board of Supervisors, they were appalled, and they're getting involved. Other people here on this Zoom have also gotten involved. So thank you. Thank everybody who's been active on this issue. I think it's having an effect. This is the time for you to hold our feet to the fire as board members. If you have compliments or criticisms or questions, okay, Thomasita, you have the floor.
First of all, I have a point of information. I was advocating for Laguna Honda on my Facebook page, etc. And somebody told me that actually conditions there were actually quite abysmal, that as soon as when they let it wasn't just patients, elderly, it was others to come in. There was drugs, there was cigarette smoking, and she's allergic, she's a cigarette smokes, and she said that actually the conditions really were bad. And I think that if people are going to support keeping it open, that they need to be vigilant that those conditions that are dangerous for the patients need to change, you know. But I wanted to ask if the board would please take a position supporting reopening JFK Drive, because there's nothing progressive about depriving elderly and disabled people from equal access to the park. And I don't know what Tim had to say about it, because a lot of times people who consider themselves progressive somehow think that it's okay to deny equal access to those of us who are disabled and elderly. And I don't see anything progressive in that. It's a lack of compassion and understanding. And so I'm hoping that the Gray Panthers can take a position to support reopening JFK Drive to everyone.
I think we have taken positions on JFK Drive. That's
Right, we are on record as a not just the board, but the entire membership voted on it, and we are on record of supporting reopening it. Seniors have issues, and it's not just a destination thing. You know, if you can't walk around in the park, you should be able to at least drive through JFK Drive and enjoy the park that way. So we are very much in favor, and we are on record in that regard, and we'll probably keep that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I answer the question about Laguna Honda?
yes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with Laguna Honda is they used it as a way to place people from San Francisco General who didn't have any place else to go. And a lot of these people have behavioral and substance abuse problems. And what occurred is they really could not handle this subpopulation who shouldn't have been in a nursing home in the first place, but there were no other funded treatment beds. And so they just kind of, they created this thing where San Francisco General could send people to Laguna Honda and the staff at Laguna Honda could not refuse them. And that is why Laguna Honda is in trouble with the feds, because of overdoses, because of lighters in rooms with smoking, in rooms with oxygen. So it's exactly the stuff that Thomasita heard about. And one of the problems is that the city wants to get recertified without admitting that there's this kind of fault on their side. And the short term for the fault is called the Flow Project, which was the project that prioritized hard to place people from San Francisco General at the expense of everyone else. But also the people from General didn't have any place to go. So the city needs to fund alternative placements and not imprison them in a nursing home where they don't belong, to be tortured themselves and to torture everyone else. And this is one of the things we can testify about this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have at least two more questions. Betty Trainer, go ahead. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, it's not really a question. It's a comment about the meeting today. It was excellent, except it was too much. You had 3 excellent speakers. Tim Redmond, 15 minutes to go through all that in fact, I expected him to go through all the ballot measures on the city ballot. So he didn't, because he didn't have the time. And the other 2, the professor from State, the Alice, they had so much information. They each could have been a meeting with adequate question and answer and action, especially Alice. She had hurriedly go through the actions that she wanted us to do. So keep that in mind, board members, to not overflow of the meeting. It was such a good one, but it could have been better if we had more time for each of the people.
Yeah,
that's all I wanted to say.
That's all
Yeah.
on me. I've had this.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Betty, I've always, and Anne can testify, because she's made that criticism. It's constructive criticism of me before. I have a tendency to pack agendas with too much, and it does a disservice to the speakers and the audience. So I agree And there was a little bit of, I got desperate about getting speakers and I overcommitted. I should have kept it to 2. I think that would have been much better. And I just was in a position where I'd already agreed to 2, to 3 people, and I couldn't really. But yeah, but
you did a good job at getting 3 really good speakers. So
that's why I had to be
I
writing
don't want
word
to be
on them.
critical. Yeah.
No, it's good to get constructive criticism, not tearing down kind of criticism. I appreciate that the sense in which the spirit in which it was delivered. So yeah, I have to keep working on that. We need more people working on our programs who bring to us crucial issues that we should be concerned about. And so we'd love to have more people working on that. Okay, David Elliott Lewis, you're next. Okay.
Yeah. Hello.
Good.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I want to second what Betty Traynor just said. Completely agree. But and especially the presentation by Tim Redmond, I would have to say, of any Zoom meeting I've attended in the last year, his 15 minutes was more useful than any other 15-minute segment I've ever attended on Zoom after hundreds of hours this last year. So I would ask that in your next meeting, you invite him back, give him more time to talk about the ballot measures, all of them. Give him a half hour or 45 minutes, and do a full meeting devoted to his insights. I think he's brilliant, and he really has his thumb on the pulse of what's going on, and it's extremely informative.
Yeah.
So I'm just making a request, an agenda item for your next meeting.
Thank you. Excellent suggestion. And we will have him back before the next month's meeting. He seems very agreeable to do that. He always loves to talk, and he has a lot to say, as you said. Okay, the next person is either Lois or Bernie.
Thank you very much. You've done a marvelous job. I would like to make 2 comments. The first deals with the comment on effect inflation in effect nationally. As Krugman indicated, one of the major aspects of inflation is what we call a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. In effect, large corporation monopolistic pricing has added to the cost of what is occurring and was exacerbated during the Reagan administration. Secondly, is to be effective, we have to deal in federal court, not to where we have elected, in effect, employees in the courts in California. We have to bring in effect what's called the Sherman Antitrust Act in San Francisco. Collusive pricing, monopolistic pricing is a factor in why we have nationally the highest cost of living in the nation. The law of greatest degree of inequity. These are enshrined in federal laws where we can have effect. Putting an effect request on our great leader, Nancy, who has scored a lot, and say, we are an example. And by the way, I put this to Barbara Lee as well, who I do have relations with. In fact, we get together and say, look at, in effect, where real estate runs our elections. The Laguna Hyena problem started with Willie Brown when we began to privatize it. That's why it's continued. This is a real estate drive, not only with Laguna Honda, but with the community college, where we could have had a much more effective occurrence there instead of a real estate drive. Okay, I think I've said enough.
Thank you very much. And there's more to be learned and acted on in regard to what you're saying. So
of course,
yeah, don't stop there. Okay, Robin.
Yeah, thank you for a great meeting. I want to go back to the scheduling of the speakers issue. I know that Tim Redmond did not have time to talk about other things on the ballot. Like I think City College is on the ballot. I would have liked to hear him talk about that. That came in with double the signatures needed to put it on the ballot. It was so popular. And then also Alice could have given a class on what she was showing us in the slideshows. I think she should be brought in for a whole meeting herself and just literally teach what happened, all through the years, those dates, and kind of walk us through, because that was very interesting. It was just too fast. So, but thank you. They were all great.
Hey, Robin, we could have, we don't have to wait a month to have a meeting that educates people on issues they care about. We could have Tim back next week. We could have the other speaker back the week after, and just to have a more leisurely approach and gain an appreciation for what they have to offer.
That'd be great.
Okay,
Thank you.
Tomasito, go ahead. Oh, one more thing before you start. The topic of our next September meeting is going to be City College.
Oh.
Can Michael, is that the case? Matthew, Ann, that's correct, isn't it? The City College ballot measure, the controversy. I think there's some divisions in the community about that. Can anybody verify that's going to be the next SF Grey Panther topic in September?
That's what Michael intended. There is also someone very concerned about transportation justice. There's this move for Uber to be the contractor that deals with taxis. It's awful. I don't know if anyone's heard about it, but it's really a nightmare. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Bernie, I see your hand up, but Tomasita's next, and then you, I think. Okay, Tomasita, go ahead.
I have 2 points. Number one, I look around here and I'm really honored to be in the circle of my peers now that I'm 73 and I'm an elder, and the wisdom that is here in the circle. I just like to, as a fighter for all my life for for respect, as a person of Nicaraguan descent and a woman, having gotten picked on in grammar school from the first day of kindergarten to the last day, because I was traditional with my long braids, etc. Anyways, let's not underestimate the value of the wisdom of those of us who are here. It's great that you bring in experts, but I can see a whole bunch of people here that are experts too. I'm looking at 14 besides myself right now. And so maybe there should be a space every meeting for us to have discussions. I've been involved in the City College issue for 10 years. I'm a member of HEAP, just like Michael Lyon. I mean, we know a lot. You don't have to ask. Tim doesn't know everything. There's a lot of details. He thinks he knows everything, but he doesn't have all the details. And so maybe there should be opportunity at every meeting to go around on an issue and find out what the people who are present know about the issue. Okay, so let's equalize things. And secondly, I want to know that since the Grey Panther board and the membership, I remember that vote, have voted to support reopening JFK Drive, I would like to ask that this is the place to ask for consent to have the Grey Panthers listed in the ballot book as co-sponsors or of the initiative, and somebody will need to sign by tomorrow, one of your officers, because there's a young man going around getting signatures for endorsements for the ballot book. And then if there's also senior organizations, there's different categories, and the organization could sign on as a supporter on any of the like the categories. There's one for seniors. So is this the place to ask? I wanted to ask once and for all, since Matt Holtz reinforced the idea that the Grey Panthers has already taken a position. Will you please agree to sign to be public about your position and sign the ballot book, an endorsement form, and who would be?
As I understand it, the purpose of the next meeting by the Grey Panthers on City College is because there is a controversy about the City College ballot measure. Isn't that the case?
No. I'm saying that to respond, I'm finished off of City College. I'm saying that since Matt reminded us that the Gray Panthers has already taken a position in support of reopening JFK Drive.
Okay, okay.
On to the deadline is tomorrow for a wet signature. Somebody needs to sign, one of your officers needs to sign saying, yes, we've taken this position. And the Gray Panthers can be listed as a supporter of that position. So I need to, since
Okay.
this is clarify that who could sign that?
I see Ann Colacheda's fellow board member with her hand raised, so I'm going to call on her first before Robin. Ann, do you have something on that?
Yes, I wonder, is there any financial obligation with that signing?
No.
You answered.
It doesn't cost any money to sign. Isn't there usually a cost associated with signing, getting an argument in the ballot book?
If I may reply, this week, this is the endorser, like there's no cost. And if there were, the campaign would pay for it.
Could you connect, could you send us the information in an email so we like right away?
Okay,
So we can.
For people's information, for your information, this Thursday is the deadline to be submitting proponents' arguments, okay? And that doesn't cost anything. But then if a person wants to put their own individual or organization paid ballot argument, that does cost, and the campaign would pay for it. And that deadline is next Monday. So that if you want to
follow up. I have a follow-up
Was that
question.
you?
I need to read it, but
Yeah.
I need to read it before I could vote on it, but otherwise I would make a motion, but I need to read it first.
Can Thomasina, can you send us the relevant information so we can act on it right away?
Okay, like, right, okay, so
No, not this minute, but at least today. I mean, as soon as possible. Could you send it? And you have all of our, you don't need to send it to all of us, but you can send it to at least one of us. But I can put the email addresses of everybody, of all of us in the chat, if you want to use that.
thank you.
But we're coming down to the end, and Robin, you have your hand up, and Ann, you had your hand up for another reason.
So that's it.
And then
Thank you.
Bernie had his hand up, and I was going to recognize Bernie first. Okay, Bernie, can you make it quick?
Very quick. I strongly advise we invite Stuart Flashman, the former attorney for the union, faculty union, with regard to probable illegal transfer of property to Bridge and Avalon. He and I were very involved in alternate propositions. He's an expert on the legality of that transfer.
The transfer of what to what?
The property is 17 acres on the reservoir site at Community College. You're about to discuss that. The second thing I would like strongly to advise as a membership meeting is a coalition of people like our other organizations, such as the Bernie Kratz San Francisco Democracy Sierra Club, to discuss what the state has dropped legally on the city regarding the General Plan Act, which the city has violated regarding, in effect, affordability and analysis, what we could call criminally complicity. And I'll leave you with this thought: from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Robin?
Sure. I'm a member of Save Muni, which is a transportation activist group. And last night we had our meeting about the Uber cab situation with Sue Vaughn, who's a member of the Citizens Advisory Committee, and also Evelyn Engel, who's with the San Francisco Taxi Workers Alliance, very strongly against the cab Uber connection. They pointed out that Uber wants to get cabs to join with them all over the world, and that they are working hard here, but it's also a global issue. And we recorded our whole meeting last night, and I believe it's going to be on the Save Muni website soon. So I just want to bring that up if you want to watch that discussion. It's really important for anybody who needs a cab, wants a cab, repair transit. Very major issue, important issue, yeah.
Thank you. Okay,
Sue Vaughn had approached me,
right.
and I had forwarded on her request. I actually thought if there had been time today, that she might have been invited for today. But we really should invite her for next month.
Yeah.
Okay. I think, yeah, I saw communication with her name in it. So we should definitely follow up on that.